go back and listen to it as well. But I wanted to introduce Nick to everybody. Um, because basically, just so you kind of understand, Nick, why I asked you to do this in the first place is because I came across your work with the Franklin scandal. That's that book. I had been familiar with the Franklin cover up and saw the documentary had never been aired and everything, and it just completely blew my mind as far as the extent of it and what was actually happening and how it went basically to the top of society. And I just thought that like it'd be good to have this conversation because even though I'm aware of it, and there are people who are more aware of this type of thing happening at these levels in society with Epstein and everything, which you've also had your part in. That people still kind of, in my opinion, don't really truly understand the scope of it and the extent of it. And I just wanted to bring you on here because you have an extensive history with this and have done a lot of the legwork, especially with the investigation into the Franklin scandal as well. And I just want to basically let you know that you tell everybody like this is something that is real and going on because even though we do know what's going on, there's still almost a cognitive dissonance there to where people don't want to really accept that this level of like evil and betrayal and manipulation exists in the world just for self-protection purposes. But that's kind of where I'm coming from this Nick. And I just wanted to give you a quick introduction. So um, Nick Bryant, he's a writer, he's an activist, he's written a lot and has focused a lot on the plight of disadvantaged children in the United States. He's published numerous national journals, including the Journal of Professional Ethics, the Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology. He's also co-authored a book called America's Children, Triumph or Tragedy. It's addressing the medical and developmental problems of lower socioeconomic children in America. He's actually the first person to publish Epstein's Black Book as well, which took him, I believe, 3 or 4 years to even get anybody to publish that. It was published via the now defunct Gawker, I believe, in 2015. The New York Times, Vanity Fairs, New York Magazine has all reported on his investigation into the Epstein child trafficking network. He's also, like I said, he's spoken a lot about child trafficking and at several conferences, including the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation International Convention and the Coalition to End Sexual Exploitation's global summits. They're sponsored by the National Center for Sexual Exploitation. He's the author of 4 books, a few of which we'll get into tonight. The aforementioned American Children, Triumph or Tragedy, Confessions of a DC Madam, The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal. And he has a new book out. It's called The Truth About Watergate that is very enlightening as well. A lot of people kind of think they know what happened with Watergate based upon what has been said by the historians and in the news. And that doesn't barely even scratch the surface of what really happened. So hopefully we'll get into a little bit of that as well. So with that said, looks like we have contact. I hear you now. All right. I thought I might have offended you with my my introduction there,
Oh, no, I like
but
I didn't realize that I'd done that much writing. So that was kind of cool.
yeah, you've done quite a lot in your career here. And with that said, I wanted to kind of pass it over to you to. I'd like to start off with kind of what I mentioned is as far as the issue of this child exploitation, child trafficking, at all levels of society. How did you actually even get into writing about this or investigating this? Because it seems like there's a common thread throughout your career that you have, you have a heart for children's issues, but specifically, how did you come into the Franklin scandal and start do the deep dive you did with that?
I had a childhood that was less than ideal. So I've always been sensitive to children's issues. And as you stated earlier, I'd written a number of articles on children's issues, and I also wrote a book about the travails of lower socioeconomic children in America. And at that point in 1995, that book was published in 1995. I moved from Minneapolis, which is where I'm more or less from, to New York City. And at that point, just became a freelance writer. And I covered a number of different things over the course of my career. But I was talking to an editor one day, and he said, pitch me dark subjects. And I kind of threw, because I'd written some articles on very dark things. And I'd written an article on a serial killer, on the carnage of Hell's Angels, on a mafia boss that performs hits. So I had danced in the dark quite a bit. But when he said, think of the darkest stories you can, and I kind of threw my hand over there, I said, Nazis, Satanists, I mean, how dark do you want it? And he had that glint in his eye, and he said, Satanists. So I had a simple plan. And when anybody says that they have a simple plan, it's going to get convoluted at some point. So I started cultivating relationships with Satanists in New York City. And I got to admit, I found most of them to be a little on the unsavory side. And I felt like I would hang out with them, attend a Black Mass, write an article. It would just be another article I've written, another payday. And I thought it would be kind of interesting to a certain degree. And then I came across a U.S. Customs report on the Finders, which was a cult that was seemingly doing very bad things to children. There were 2 finders that were busted with 6 children in Tallahassee, Florida. And a doctor for Tallahassee Protective Services said that 2 of the children had been sexually abused. And I guess that there was child pornography in the van. So the U.S. Customs Service, which investigates child pornography, and the DC police executed a search warrant on the Finders warehouse. And the Finders, according to the DC police, an informant had talked about a murder that they had been involved in, and also quote unquote blood rituals. And what they found was truly incriminating. They did find child pornography. They found children slaughtering, pictures of children slaughtering a goat. There was a telex that said that they were going to purchase 2 children in Hong Kong. I mean, it was very, very, very sordid, much darker than I ever could have imagined sitting in that editor's office. And so the investigative report is written by a U.S. Customs officer named Ramon Martinez. And he gets into detail about just how sordid it is. And then the Finders, they find documentation about the Finders answering want ads in newspapers that are looking for babysitters and finding out how many kids that each family has and doing reconnaissance on the family. So there were a lot of incriminating things found. And Ramon Martinez, who was part of executing that search warrant and wrote the U.S. Customs report that is bounced around the internet, he hadn't heard anything. So a few days later, he went to the DC police and he talked to a DC detective who said that the CIA had taken over the investigation of the Finders and that there will be no additional law enforcement investigation. And that blew my mind. I couldn't believe that the CIA would quash an investigation into something like that. I mean, first of all, the CIA doesn't have any domestic ability or legally supposed to spy on us or even conduct any kind of surreptitious operations in the United States. I mean, that hasn't prevented it, but it's against the law. But I saw I saw that U.S. Customs report and then the CIA, and I could not. It's one of those things where you just don't understand it. And I thought that I was a semi-edified person. I'd gone to college and I'd gone to graduate school. I'd worked at a university for 5 years. But I could not make any sense of that document. And there was a paradigm that I was missing. So I decided to start looking for other scenarios where children had been trafficked and intelligence was involved. And there was a book called The Franklin Cover Up that was written by a former Nebraska state senator about something similar to that. And then there was a documentary called Conspiracy of Silence. Now, both the book and the documentary made a number of extremely salacious claims. And I didn't think that the book really had the goods to offer what it was saying. And I thought that the documentary, although I think it's woken a lot of people up, it too is pretty flimsy as far as offering supportive corroboration. But I mean, between DeCamp's book and the Conspiracy of Silence documentary, I had concluded that something had happened in Omaha, Nebraska. And I thought it was primarily an Omaha, Nebraska thing. I had a hard time believing that kids were being flown around the country. I had a hard time believing that Boys Town students were involved. I had a hard time believing it was tied to intelligence. And I had a hard time believing that the Department of Justice and the FBI would cover it up. I really had a hard time believing those things. But I studied philosophy in college, and I always try to approach things essentially Socratically, in that I try to remain agnostic about things until I actually look into them and I have some experience or someone can offer me some empirical evidence. So I went to Nebraska. I went to Omaha knowing that something had gone down, but I wasn't exactly sure of what exactly had gone down.
Now, Nick, so you spent years, when all said and done, writing the Franklin scandal by going back and forth to Nebraska and Omaha and speaking to people who were directly involved with this, right? So I know I've read about some other interviews you've done, and you've developed a relationship with some of the key figures here, and really took a lot. I mean, I just the investigative commitment is just incredible from what I've read and what I've heard you've done with this particular story. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences when you actually went there and started coming to the realization that, oh my God, this actually has some teeth?
When I got there, I started to ask people that were affiliated with the Franklin scandal about what they knew. And it was like I was doing an expose on the KGB and Stalinist Russia. It was the Franklin scandal had been covered up in like 1991. The finishing touches had been covered up in 1991. And I was asking questions in 2002. So I was 11 years removed from it. And people were terrified to talk about it, just terrified. So that was an initial indicator. And then I talked to some people that were directly involved with it, and they were tough to talk to. They did not want to talk to me, but they talked to me. And then they seemed to not be lacking in veracity. I mean, they seemed to be telling me the truth. I mean, that was my gut feeling at the time. But then, now I didn't even have a cell phone in 2002. But then, and I was staying with a buddy, and I hadn't seen my buddy in a while. And I thought, I'd look into this, and I didn't think that much would come of it. And then I'd just hang out with my buddy for a week. So at that point, I was 3 or 4 days into it, and I was loud. I was making as much noise as I possibly could about this. I just wanted to see what would happen. And then,
and when you say you're making noise, just walk us through what were I mean, you're just speaking, going to bars, going to places, and is just making it known that you're there to investigate this. Is that what you mean?
Exactly. And
okay.
Actually, I was going into bureaucratic institutions too, and
okay.
And asking people that had been involved. And law enforcement started calling my friend's house, and or actually his apartment. And that was kind of surprising because I had given my number to law enforcement. And then I was followed in a car. And on my last night, and at this point, my buddy had made some calls, and he was somewhat connected to the darkest underbelly of Omaha. And he talked to someone who was a drug distributor for this network because drugs were pretty integral to it. And this guy just broke down crying. And he wouldn't talk to me. And then on my last night there, I had a death threat. And that really, when you get a death threat, that kind of seals the deal. Mm-hmm. So I went back to New York. I was stunned. I'd never had a death threat before, which is kind of a new and exciting experience.
Could I just do you care to talk about how that occurred, or
sure,
in what manner?
So it was my last night there. My buddy Dirk was going to cook us a dinner. He's a good cook, and I was just kind of chilling out watching the History Channel. It had been kind of an intense week for me. And a woman came to the door, kind of a freaky looking woman, and she knocked on it. And I went to the door. I didn't open it. And she said that she wanted to give me a book. And I said, and at this point I was freaked out. I didn't want my fingerprints on that book, and I didn't want her fingerprints in that apartment. This is how freaked out I was, because I had come across colossal law enforcement corruption. So I didn't want to open myself up to anything that could be very deleterious to me. And she eventually left, and then my buddy passed her in the lobby of the apartment complex. And she was kind of freaky looking, and he was taken aback. And then he came back with a bag of groceries, and I said, "Man, did you see that woman?" And he goes, "Yeah." I said, "She's been trying to give me a book." And at this point we were both pretty freaked out, that because he didn't know what was gonna turn up, and I certainly didn't know what was going to turn up. And so he started to make dinner, and I kept watching the History Channel. And then she came back, and then we huddled, and I said to him, "Dude, I really don't want our fingerprints on that book." She wanted to give me a book, and I don't know what book it was. And then I said, "And I don't think it's a good idea to have her fingerprints in your apartment." So she eventually left, but her parting shot was, "You're in a great deal of danger, and they're going to kill you." And at that point, I was pretty stunned. So I went back to New York City, where I'm living, and I had a mentor, an older guy. He was a retired journalist, and really a good guy, super guy. Love that guy. He's since passed away. And we were walking through Washington Square Park, and I was still freaked out, man. I was like looking for snipers on the buildings. Mm-hmm. And he said to me, so we sat down, and he said to me, "I think that," and I said, "Jerry, it's true. All of it's true. I mean, they're transporting kids, they're Boys Town kids. There's blackmail involved. There's high-powered politicians involved. It's all true." And we sat at this bench, and he said, "Nick, could be very dangerous for you. If you decide to disengage from it, I won't lose any respect for you." And I said, "Jerry, all these kids were destroyed with impunity, and I think I'm going to have to do this." And that was that. So I went to Omaha 13 times over the course of the 7-year investigation. And I went to Washington, D.C. also a couple of times. So I put in a lot of miles over the course of those 7 years of researching and writing the Franklin Scandal.
So 13 years, or you said 7 years, I'm sorry, 7 years writing it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess tell us what you discovered. You just barely touched on that, but I mean, for the people listening, like, in plain language, what exactly did you uncover for those who may not be familiar with what the Franklin Scandal was all about?
Well, I uncovered interstate pedophile network that flew children from coast to coast and pandered them to rich and wealthy guys. The guy in DC, there were two guys that ran it. One was Lawrence King of Omaha, Nebraska. One was Craig Spence of Washington, D.C. And Craig Spence was a CIA asset, and his home was wired for audiovisual blackmail. Now, I did write a second book that dealt with Craig Spence a little bit, called Confessions of a D.C. Man, The Politics of Sex, Lies, and Blackmail. And Craig Spence was a nefarious character and also a CIA asset and a blackmail artist. I think he was kind of the brains. I don't think that Lawrence King really was the brains of the operation. But Lawrence King would he would tap Boys Town for kids whenever he wanted them.
And didn't Lawrence King sing the national anthem at like the RNC National Convention? I recall, like that's how connected this guy was.
He did. He's at the 1984 Republican convention. He sang the national anthem, and he's got a very good voice. I should say that. I mean, he's a very evil, malignant character, but he's got a very good voice.
Who's actually walked free now, and I saw that you posted a picture of him in the wild here just in the last couple of weeks. So this guy's actually still out there walking the earth.
He's been out there preying on children. So what happened with the Franklin scandal is King embezzled $40 million from it. Now, I think a lot of that money, there were sources, I didn't say this in the book, but there were sources that did tell me that a lot of it went to the Contras.
Okay.
I don't know if that's true, but I do believe that it wouldn't surprise me. But he did embezzle $40 million from the Franklin Credit Union, which was a credit union for lower socioeconomic people. It should have had about 2.5 million in it. So the Nebraska Senate decided to launch an investigation to look at the Franklin scandal and look at all the money that had been taken out, because the Franklin Credit Union hadn't been audited for 4 years. And federally insured credit unions have to be audited every year. So a number of the senators were really baffled by that. So the Franklin Committee was formed, and this was a committee that was going to look at the corruption at the Franklin scandal. And as soon as they formed, some social service personnel went to the senators and said, King is running an interstate pedophile network. And they had given all this information, not only to federal law enforcement, but to state law enforcement, and they were just completely ignored. And then the senators started looking into that. And they eventually hired an amazing private investigator named Gary Caradori. Mm-hmm. And most of the documentation that I eventually got about my investigation came from Gary Caradori, although I did get sealed grand jury documents too, which were really, really indispensable in my investigation. But the investigative notes, and then the leads list of Gary Caradori, which had like 325 names, that became my grail because it listed about 60 victims. And my job was to find those victims. And those victims were, a lot of them were really hard to find because they'd come from dysfunctional, lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And they'd been caught up in this pedophile network, some starting at the age of 11. And they were flown around and repeatedly molested. And if they performed, they would be given drugs and money. And so a lot of these victims didn't use their social security numbers. They just, they had gone into like a netherworld on the margins of society. So that was my job, was to find these victims. And ultimately, there was a grand jury. There were 2 grand juries, and this was a very large network. We'll get into Epstein's network after this, but I believe that this network was much bigger than Epstein's network. I think the Franklin Network was only around for 10 to 12 years, whereas Epstein was around for about 25 years. So I think that both probably destroyed the same amount of children.
Mm.
But the Franklin scandal was huge, and it required two grand juries in Nebraska, a federal and state grand jury, and also a grand jury in Washington, D.C. to cover it up. Now, I don't know if your listeners are familiar with how grand juries work, but grand juries are infamous and they're very easy to corrupt because a special prosecutor is chosen, and grand jurors are just people that have shown up for jury duty and they've been funneled into a grand jury. And the only evidence that's presented to them and the only witnesses that are called are the ones that the special prosecutor calls. There was a famous quip by a New York Supreme Court judge that said, special prosecutors have so much power over grand jurors that they could get them to indict a ham sandwich. When people think of grand jury, they think of that the gods of jurisprudence have spoken, but that's not really the case. Grand juries are notorious for being corrupted. And these were very corrupt grand juries in Nebraska. The state grand jury actually indicted two of the kids that refused to recant accounts of their abuse and let all the perpetrators off free. One of the girl, Alicia Owen, was looking at she was looking at 160 years. She was indicted on 8 counts of perjury. And the boy, Paul Benassi, was indicted on 3 counts of perjury. So he's looking at 60 years. So you got these kids who were viciously abused. I mean, viciously. And the same thing went on with Epstein, although it's been sanitized. But there was a lot of viciousness. And some of the things that these kids had endured was just unbelievably brutal. And these grand juries, both of them in Nebraska, the federal and the state, exonerated all the perpetrators. And then there was a DC grand jury, and that exonerated all the perpetrators. So it was, and this network was pandering children to the upper echelon of the Bush 1 administration. So it was imperative that this network be covered up, because I think if the dominoes had started falling in Nebraska, they would have fallen all the way to Washington, D.C. And that would have really jeopardized Bush 1's administration, and it could have jeopardized the entire Bush dynasty.
And the connection potentially to the Contras is interesting as well. And the Iran-Contra scandal, because they did need to raise the money, right? That's the whole point of it, selling the drugs and shipping them money for arms for the Contras. Did you ever uncover anything else about that connection, or is that all you discovered as far as?
A couple of people that were pretty plugged into the Franklin Credit Union, and I think one of them was a very good source. And he told me that the money was going to the Contras, but I only had 2 corroborations, and one of them was kind of weak. And the book that I was writing was so antithetical to what people believe. I really only went with as much. If I wanted to go anywhere, I really needed triple corroboration or quadruple corroboration, and I was only able to get double corroboration with the Contras. But it wouldn't have surprised me, because Lawrence Walsh, the prosecutor for the Iran-Contra, and that was kind of a travesty, because Bush Sr. pardoned everybody that would have that Walsh was going to call. But he was talking about the difficulties that the CIA was having raising money for the Contras. And they'd actually gone to a Saudi prince who kicked in some money. So I think that they were cobbling together millions and millions of dollars from wherever they could get it. And I think King lived high on King's lifestyle was 5-star. I mean, he'd rent jets, he'd stay at the best hotels, eat at the best restaurants, had multiple diamond rings. I mean, just nouveau rich pig. And so I do believe that that some of that money probably was funneled to the Contras.
Did you ever reach out to him or have any encounters with him?
With King,
Yeah.
well, I really wanted to talk to King. Needless to say, I was writing a book about his pedophile network, so I really wanted to
Yeah.
talk to him. And he did. Okay, so the grand juries in Nebraska concluded that he hadn't molested a single child. And he did about 10 years in prison, excuse me, for his financial crimes. He didn't do any time at all for molesting scores of children and pandering scores of children. And he ended up with a no-show job at a BMW dealership in Alexandria, Virginia. And I got his private number and I called him. And I said, Larry. And he goes, yeah. I said, this is Nick Bryant. And he goes, I'm not Larry. And then he hung up. So.
Oh, it's kind of interesting. It was in Alexandria, of all places.
Yes. And that's where the BMW dealership is. And his malignant fat ass is still in Virginia. He's in Reston, Virginia now. Although he did take a trip to Omaha a couple of weeks ago, and I got a picture of it. And actually, that kind of went viral on Twitter. I got like 175,000 views on it.
Yeah, I did. I saw that. He's looking as malignant as ever. Standing
He
out. It's
definitely
I
is.
mean,
And here's the thing about that. I mean, like the investigator that was really doing a good job that was uncovering this, he got blackmail pictures. He realized he had become, he was, when the FBI really went into cover-up mode on this, he became the hunter, or he was the hunter, but then he became the hunted. And he realized that the FBI was completely destroying his case and really intimidating victims. And he felt like he had to get compromise pictures. And he reached out, he found one of the compromise photographers. His name is Rusty.
Yeah, Rusty. Okay.
And they met in Chicago, and Rusty gave him pictures. Now, Rusty has a tenuous relationship with truth. And I wouldn't go solely on his word, but I've got 4 other people that corroborate that Caradori got pictures in Chicago. So there's 5 corroborations that Caradori.
Now, with Caradori, he met his end, correct? Through a
after he got the pictures and he was flying back to Nebraska and his plane blew up.
With his son in it, correct?
He was killed and his son was killed, yes.
So the very trip that he was going there, because he only told a couple people he was going there to meet, I don't know, was it Rusty or was it somebody else who had the pictures?
It was Rusty Nelson who had the pictures.
Okay. Who you've actually spent some time with as well, correct?
I've spent a lot of time with Rusty. And in investigations like this, excuse me, you've got to deal with unsavory people. That's just the way it is. And I ended up spending a lot of time with Rusty. I think Rusty was pretty honest with me initially, but his relationship with truth became increasingly tenuous. And at a certain point, I knew that he was lying to me. But I think he was fairly honest in the beginning. But the only time I used his word in the Franklin scandal is when I had a lot of corroboration for it. And Alicia Owen and Paul Benassi did go to prison. And actually, Alicia got 9 to 15 years for perjury. She was the federal grand jury indicted her for perjury. So she was looking, between the state and the federal grand jury, she was looking at 200 years in prison. And she went to court, and it was kind of a kangaroo court. Now, here's a kid that came forward when she was 20, and she'd been trafficked by very vicious, evil people throughout her adolescence. And she was given 9 to 15 years, kid, and then the authorities really tried to destroy her. They put her in solitary confinement for 2 years. And that was, and then on the Washington, D.C. side, Craig Spence killed himself. And there's speculation on the internet that Craig Spence was suicided. I don't believe that. What I do
He,
believe is
he was
that
told to suicide himself, right? Basically.
I believe he said he was told because Spence had gotten a little crazy with, he was smoking too much crack cocaine. And that can be an impediment to mental health, crack cocaine. And I think his overseers saw that he was going a little crazy, and they said, Craig, you can either kill yourself or, we'll do it. So Craig picked his milieu, which was the Ritz-Carlton in Boston, and overdosed on nortriptyline, which is an antidepressant.
Can you tell us a little bit about where he lived in Washington and the setup that he had for the blackmail operation? Because he had a bunch of two-way mirrors and just things hooked up everywhere, just similar to what's been said about Epstein's place in New York as well.
And P. Diddy. Yes.
Yeah.
And he lived in a very opulent neighborhood, the Colorama section of Washington, D.C. And his entire house was bugged for audiovisual blackmail. Henry Vincent, who I previously referenced in the book Confessions of a D.C. Madam, he and I wrote a book together about his experiences. And he dealt with King and Spence.
No, just for the listeners, he's the gentleman who actually run the male prostitute service.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
He ran the escort service. And Spence, and we're talking like mid 80s now, Spence was spending up to $20,000, $25,000 a month on his escorts. And Spence would summon Henry occasionally. Spence was this like really exalted figure. Or at least he looked at himself as exalted. And so Henry showed up at Spence's house one day, and he always had bodyguards because he was a blackmailer. And I think that the reason why he had bodyguards is because he blackmailed not only he was a CIA asset, and I believe that he blackmailed for intelligence, but I believe he also blackmailed for his own self-enrichment. But anyway, Henry is called down, and King and Spence are sitting next to each other, and there's like a little sugar bowl filled with Coke, and Spence and King are talking about how much power they have and how much money they have, and Henry was actually getting quite bored. And then Spence started to ask Henry about his childhood, where he grew up, and Henry was a mortician by trade, and Spence kept on asking him personal questions, and Henry had just viewed Spence as like a seismic narcissist. So it was like Henry was watching the Waters part, that this seismic narcissist was actually taking an interest in him. And Henry told Spence about his escort service and how he ran it and how he got into it. And then Spence stood up and motioned him. And then King had this malignant smirk on his face. Spence got up and motioned him to the closet. And behind the closet was a secret panel. And they went into the secret room that did have a two-way mirror. And there were a bunch of monitors. And Spence starts to hit the buttons of the monitors. And he plays footage of Henry talking about his escort service. And Spence said, I blackmail people. That's my job, and consider yourself blackmailed. So at that point, although Spence was spending $20,000, $25,000 a month, Henry was very naive, and he had no idea how evil these men were and that he was making a Faustian pact. He didn't have a clue until it was too late, and that's usually how it works.
Mm-hmm. So what happened to him in the end? I don't remember. Not Spence, but the Henry.
Greta Van Susteren was Henry's lawyer, and she completely sold him out. What the feds
Mm.
did is Henry was running a gay escort service. I mean, he was running a gay escort service. And the feds came after him with a 43 count RICO indictment, sealed RICO indictment, which is generally, RICO indictments are generally for mafiosi or,
Mm-hmm.
organized crime elements. But what they did is they ratcheted up the years. So Henry was looking at 295 years with all the RICO indictments and predicates. And the government basically said to Henry, if you talked, you could really embarrass a lot of people. But if you do talk, we will put you away for 295 years. You will never, ever see freedom again. Now, if you keep your mouth shut, we'll only put you away for 5 years. And Greta Van Susteren allowed this whole thing, this travesty of justice to occur. And Henry ultimately was put away for 5 years.
Is he still alive?
He still is. And we talk. I talk with Alicia Owen and I talk with Henry. I really got quite fond of both of them.
So
It's
with Alicia, she just to backtrack with her, she was pretty dead set on exposing this, and I know that if anybody watched the the documentary about the Franklin scandal, they actually show that the feds tried to get uh, the other gentleman to have her flip on him, basically say that they reneged on what they were saying and they lied about everything that they were saying, which is eventually what went after her for. But she was pretty steadfast in trying to expose this and didn't really play along with that, right?
Alicia Owen is one of the more remarkable human beings that you'll ever meet. She stood up to the FBI, she stood up to the Department of Justice, and she stood up to the national media. I mean, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Esquire magazine, they all did hatchet jobs on her. Well,
Mhm.
not so much the Washington Post, but it reported on what had happened to her. But yes, she stood up to, and here's a kid, and what's amazing about Alicia is here's a kid that was trafficked when she was an adolescent. I mean, and as I said earlier, traffickers are vicious. Maxwell and Epstein were vicious. P. Diddy is vicious. These people are vicious. And she was subjected to their viciousness. And then she was put in prison for a very long time and spent 2 years in solitary. And as I said, the authorities really tried to destroy her by putting her in solitary for 2 years. I mean, could you imagine that? To be a 20, 21
That's
year old
insane.
in solitary for 2 years?
It's insane. I mean, she has to be a remarkable person just to have the willpower to just not fold in the face of all these institutions and powerful people coming after you. I mean, that is something special. And without her doing that too, a lot of this, as far as the extent of our knowledge, wouldn't even be in public sphere.
Well, the thing is, two grand juries in Nebraska had said that there was no child abuse. And she had to be found guilty to sanctify those grand juries. Because if she was
Mhm.
found innocent, then those grand juries would be called into question. But the state and the feds pulled out all the stops, did a lot of dirty tricks. You can read the book.
Mhm.
Planted evidence in the jury room. I mean, the judge was obviously either really stupid or really corrupt or both. Uh, and the prosecution was unbelievably. There were so many appeals in her case that it was quite remarkable. And despite everything that was done to her in that trial, the jury still deliberated for 3 days on whether or not she was guilty. And she came back, they came back after 3 days and said guilty. And because the trial just barely got Alicia by the skin of their teeth, although they thought it was going to be a slam dunk. They'd completely stacked the odds in their favor. They immediately dropped the perjury charges against Paul Benassi. Paul had been deeper into the network than Alicia had. Alicia had never been flown to Washington, D.C., and Paul had been flown to Washington, D.C. many times. I actually acquired, Gary Caradori managed to get 200 passenger manifests of Kings, and I basically got everything that Gary Caradori got. And most of the flights go to Washington, D.C. And Paul had been to Washington, D.C., and he could name at least one congressman that was a pedophile. And he also knew about the blackmail. Alicia wasn't really, she wasn't really cognizant of the darker machinery behind King and Spence. So,
and Paul is he's the one who the feds tried to have him call her too
no,
and trap her on the phone. Who was that?
Alicia and Troy had been boyfriend and girlfriend, and
Okay.
the FBI had Troy try to entrap Alicia when she was in prison. Mm-hmm. But Alicia held fast, and it's kind of interesting. Troy was the primary witness against Alicia. There was also Danny King, who had been in that network too. Troy and Danny had been in the network. Troy was much deeper into it than Danny had been. And the FBI really coached them on how to lie. But it was still like Abbott and Costello meet the grand jury. If it hadn't been for Samuel Van Pelt and the corruption of the state grand jury, Thomas Tolkien, the corruption of the federal grand jury, and then the corruption of the trial, these guys, if all things were even, there's no way that they could have withstood the scrutiny of any kind of investigation.
Mm-hmm. And this, I mean, this story resonates so much for me, and it has since I learned of it years ago, just because I relate it to, like, people are always bringing up, calling people conspiracy theorists and pejoratives if they try and, make connections and actually critically think or try to say something that's outside the common narrative. And for me, this is like a perfect example to point to say, look, conspiracies and things of this nature actually do exist in reality, and it's not out of the realm of possibility. When people are speculating and they've called conspiracy theorists, it's just one of these, like, your book can be a real, to borrow a better phrase, a red pill for individuals who are kind of anti-conspiratorial thinking. There's like a sense of that out at large where people are basically told not to believe these types of things because they're conspiracy theorists. And I'm sure you've been called it plenty of times.
I've definitely been called it. It's kind of funny. I wrote all these things on lower socioeconomic children, and I wrote a book on lower socioeconomic children. I was lauded for my efforts. But then when I write about this, I'm no longer lauded for my efforts. I'm castigated. I mean, that Wikipedia page on the Franklin child abuse allegations has been taken over by some type of operatives, and they won't allow a modicum of truth to enter into that Wikipedia page. I even called Jimmy Wales. I got his private cell phone number, and Jimmy said he'd look into it, and he didn't. So that's been very difficult because I spent 7 years at it, and I couldn't get it published in New York City. And you talk about cognitive dissonance. I met with various editors and publishers, and this was after I had the goods. I mean, I had the sealed grand jury documentation. I had Gary Caradori's investigative reports. I had the sealed grand jury testimony. In that book, I bring the reader.
Yeah, you provide it at the end. You could read them all for yourself.
Well, some of them. I mean, I'm drawing from thousands and thousands and thousands of documents. But with what I show in the Franklin scandal is I bring the reader right into a grand jury. And because for me to publish that grand jury testimony, that was illegal for me to do that. but I felt that what I was doing, I was going against such a wave of evil that I was going to do that. And if I was going to get arrested, so be it. I mean, that's how I felt. But I had to deal with so much cognitive dissonance. I tried to pitch the Franklin scandal as an article, and then I tried to pitch it as a book. I had a good agent. They dropped me. And then I got my second agent was pretty good. And he couldn't get any traction on it whatsoever. And I had to get it published by a small publisher. I mean, if it hadn't been for trying to, I don't know if that book ever would have been published. It was, and it was so immaculately sourced, and I could back up everything. And it's interesting, Boys Town, I have a chapter on all the Boys Town kids that I found who were trafficked. And Boys Town is highly litigious. They go after, there were 4 kids that launched lawsuits about sexual abuse, and Boys Town opened up their psychiatric files to the public. I mean, that's how vicious Boys Town is. And there was one group that rates charities, and they downgraded Boys Town from an A to a B or something like that. And Boys Town sued them. So we didn't know whether or not Boys Town was going to sue us. But here's the thing on that. By the time the Franklin scandal was published, I had so much dirt on Boys Town. I've got dirt on Boys Town that wasn't even in that book. And if they would have opened themselves up for discovery,
exactly,
knowing what I know, it would have been very problematic for them.
Yeah, that's how you kind of know that you're onto something there, because if they're that litigious, they have to know that you have the goods, and yeah, they just don't want to open themselves up for legal scrutiny, which they deserve. But I want to be respectful of your time, and you mentioned it took you quite a long time just to, after your 7-year investigation and writing the book, to even get it published. And that brings me to the Epstein Black Book, and you went through a similar process with that. Can you tell us a little bit about, for anybody who isn't aware, Nick actually is the first person to obtain the Black Book and actually publish it eventually on Gawker. But he had the goods for 3 years with this. And all these names are in this book. It's online now, you can find it like archive.org, and go through it. It's amazing the amount of names that are in this. But he had to go through 3 years of trying to get somebody to publish it. So first, can you tell us how you came to obtain it? Because that's interesting in itself. And then the process of trying to pitch this to editors and just being turned away whenever it's one of the biggest stories in the world.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. I was thoroughly exhausted by the Franklin scandal. The book was published in late 2009, early 2010, and I was thoroughly exhausted. And actually, I lost my apartment in Manhattan because I just put all my resources into the Franklin scandal. I became kind of obsessed with making sure that that book got published. And then when I couldn't get anybody, and here's the thing, I had been in the media for quite some time. I was plugged into the media, and I thought, I knew that most of my buddies in the media would shirk or abrogate their responsibilities. But I thought that there would certainly be some of my friends in the media that would help me out, but no one helped me. Well, actually, Malachi McCord tried to help me, and he was the only one. And so I was exhausted, and I lost my apartment, and actually, I lost my fiance too.
Oh no!
It was the fiance went first, though, and then the apartment. And actually, to tell you the truth, I miss the apartment much more than the fiance. Anyway, it's a true statement. I'm here to be honest. And so I ended up in this hovel in Brooklyn, and it was a very dark time in my life. I put all this effort into the Franklin scandal. People that read it told me that I should have won a Pulitzer Prize, that it was amazing investigative journalism. And all as I did was get ostracized, which was really troubling. And the process was I would pitch the article to editors, and I would pitch the book to editors. And at a certain point, I could just see their cognitive machinery. And they would say to themselves, this is a horrible story. I have to help Nick Bryant. Or I can just write Nick Bryant off as crazy, and then I can have a nice dinner with my family tonight. So, and the latter one all the time. So I'm in this hovel in Brooklyn, and I'm really broke, trying to survive. A friend of mine had become an editor of a magazine, and that was giving me some money. And I was just, at that point, I'd been a professional writer for about 15 years. And I really I didn't know of any other way to make a living. I mean, I could have made a living, I guess, as an Uber driver or something like that. But I'd been a writer for so long. And then I just decided to keep writing. And when I was in Brooklyn, I kept writing, I kept investigating. Even though I had great difficulty selling my stuff, I just kind of had this faith that things were going to work out. And I started reading about Epstein, and there was a grand jury that said that state grand jury said that Epstein hadn't molested a single child.
And Nick, what year is this when you learned of the Epstein thing?
I started looking into Epstein in 2012, 2011, okay. 2012. And I went to Florida in 2012. And I started just beat the streets. And I kind of like how I did with Franklin. I just showed up in town, and I just started knocking on doors, and people talked to me. Some people were really difficult to talk to, didn't want to talk. I encountered the same thing with Franklin. But there were people that were willing to talk to me. And I eventually acquired the Black Book and a bunch of Epstein's passenger manifests too. So I started calling, the only people I started calling in the Black Book were the victims. I wanted to see, and there was a lot of victims. There were over the numbers of, I think, over 100 victims.
Now, when you say acquired it, with obviously it's through a source, so you don't want to tell us who gave it to you or whatnot. But was it just firsthand, or did somebody get you in contact with somebody that knew about it? Like, can you give us any details about the acquisition itself without giving too much away?
Okay, so what happened was Epstein's house manager, Alfredo Rodriguez, he purloined the Black Book. And he tried to sell it to various attorneys that were launching civil suits at Epstein, representing underage girls. And one of the attorneys called the FBI, and then the FBI did a sting on Rodriguez and busted him because he had been deposed and said that he didn't have any information about Epstein. Meanwhile, he thought that he was going to make a killing off this Black Book. So the FBI got it. And then the FBI gave it to some people that ultimately gave it to me. That's the problem. And I started calling these victims, and then they started telling me about being flown around. And at that point, I knew that I was dealing with another network. And this was before anything came out about blackmail, or Epstein was being treated as like a lone pervert. And
and he had already been to jail, well, if you want to call it that. And there'd been a miscarriage of justice that already had happened at this point. He should have been behind bars at this point, basically, right?
Yeah, no, he was. What happened there was, okay, so there was a state grand jury. The Palm Beach Police Department was going to charge him with 5 counts of the abuse of minors. And they knew of, the Palm Beach Police Department knew of 17 other minors. So in totality, they had 22 minors that Epstein had molested that all basically said the same thing. And the case was taken away. They executed a search warrant at Epstein's place, and they felt like it was a slam dunk, because not only did they have the names of the 5 victims that had come forward, but they had a number of people that corroborated the victims. And then the case was taken away from them, which is very strange in Florida, because generally only, and even to a grand jury, and generally only capital cases in Florida are given to grand juries. So the fix was already in, and that grand jury came back. That grand jury, the law enforcement knew of 22 underage victims, and that grand jury, Barry Kirshner was the special prosecutor. He called 1 victim, and that was it. He called 1 victim, and then he skewered her. So the grand jury concluded that Epstein hadn't molested a single underage minor, and he was indicted on 1 count of adult pandering. And excuse me, the Palm Beach police chief, Michael Ryder, who is like a hero in this. I mean, he is the hero.
Yeah, without him, basically nothing comes out.
Without him, nothing comes out. He really became quite vociferous. And he said, this is the worst failure of the Justice Department that has occurred in modern times. He didn't know about the Franklin scandal, but, I mean, from his perspective. And he took a lot of heat. I mean, he was followed. There were dead animals put on his doorstep. I mean, he took a lot of heat, but he did not back down. And, God bless heroes like this. I mean, there were senators in the Franklin committee that refused to back down. And that's why we know about the Franklin scandal. That's why Gary Caradori was hired. That's why a grand jury had to be, these grand juries had to, these really dirty grand juries had to be impaneled. So God bless these guys, man. Michael Ryder is a hero. So at this point, he goes to the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice under Alexander Acosta has a list of over 32 Epstein victims, underage Epstein victims, over 32. And I've got the list, and to look at it is just daunting. And Alexander Acosta says, okay, we're going to impanel a grand jury, and we're going to look into this, and we're going to seek justice. And this was all done because of Michael Ryder's just vociferousness. And according to Alexander Acosta, and he's never recanted this, he was told to back away from Epstein because Epstein was intelligence and it was above his pay grade. He's been asked that publicly, and he's never denied it at all. So,
and he actually ended up becoming an official within the Trump administration, right?
That's where it came out. He was being vetted as labor secretary for the Trump administration, and he was asked, "Why didn't you go after Epstein harder?" And he said, "Because I was told that it was intelligence, that Epstein was intelligence, and to back off." And the state ultimately gave Epstein 18 months, and Epstein did 13 months, but he didn't have to, he only had to go there at night, and he fixed it up like the Taj Mahal, and he gave his jailers a bunch of money. It was a complete travesty, and he was molesting girls. Well, he was ostensibly incarcerated. It was just a travesty.
Now, your common sense would tell you if Acosta said it was intelligence, given he is in the United States, you would think probably CIA. But there's also been some talks of Mossad connections through Maxwell and her father and all that. Do you have any insight into that as far as actual? Because there's never been any solid proof that I've came across that confirms that, other than say what Acosta said. But is there any sources or anything that you've come up with that you'd think that there has to be some type of intelligence connection given the scope of these crimes and the way that it was covered up. But what's your sense of that? And
I think there's two
if
points there, and I'll answer the first one. With Epstein, people have said he's with the Mossad, but here's my thoughts on it. There's no way that the CIA would allow the Mossad to compromise American politicians on American soil and not get a cut of that intelligence. That's not going to happen. So I don't believe that it was. Now, the Mossad might have been active with Epstein, but they were in bed with the CIA.
Mhm.
Although I've got no doubts about that. And when you talk about intelligence and power, Alexander Acosta was told to stand down. There's only constitutionally, there is only two people in the government that can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down. One is the attorney general and one is the president. That's the kind of power that was deployed to get
Mhm.
Epstein that sweetheart deal in 2008.
So you had this book for 3 years. How did you? First of all, were you getting anxious about having it, given what just happened to the person who had it previously? Um, did anybody else know that you had it at the time, other than the editors that you were pitching? I guess I'd be kind of freaked out, having this in my possession. Like, what were you going through in
Well,
those 3 years?
I made copies of it and sent it to other people. I mean, I did that in the
Okay.
channel too.
Uh-huh.
Oh, one way or another, it's going to get out there. And then I was going to magazines and I was pitching it, and they were telling me not interested, not interested, not interested. And then Gawker published it, and I was really grateful for that. And they let me even write a couple of articles about it. And then the floodgates opened. I mean, once the Black Book was published, all these other publications published articles about the Black Book. I mean, there's been tons of ink that has been spilled about the Black Book, tons of ink, and I believe that only one publication has given me any credit for it. I mean,
Hmm.
I find that to be kind of mind-boggling. You would think that publications would come to me and say, Nick, you've been at this for 3 years. You came up with the Black Book. You've got a lot of other information. How about sharing it with us? How about writing an article? I did not get any of that.
Amazing. Did you get any threats or anything in the 3 years while you had it in your possession?
No, not at all. But I was really struggling financially during that period,
Mhm.
and it was a very dark period of my life because I did not want to pursue Epstein. I really didn't. Franklin had taken a lot out of me. I'd lost a lot because of Franklin. But when I went down to Florida and I got the Black Book and I started calling victims and they were telling me about being flown around, I just said, I got to do this again. I mean, I've got to do this again. And so there was darkness. I mean, it was very obvious that my mail was being opened and stuff like that. There wasn't any pretense to hide it. I mean, that wasn't
Mhm.
my mail wasn't being opened every day, but there was obviously, and there was someone who I was corresponding with that was, I think, someone that maybe this dark malignant corner of intelligence didn't necessarily want me to correspond with, and those letters were always ripped open,
Mm.
and it was it was a tough time for me. But
I
the,
mean, I could just imagine coming off of that investigation, just the toll it just takes on your spirit and your soul, just knowing and also knowing that no justice had occurred as well. You know what I mean? So I could definitely understand the trepidation wanting to go into another one of these things. I mean, it just boggles the mind that something of this scale, in both cases, power can be things can be brought to power that can actually cover it up. even though there's so much evidence that it occurred. You know what I mean? Is that, I mean, do you ask yourself like, I'm sure that's one of the several paradigm shifting things that you went through these investigations. Is like just the sheer amount of cover up and corruption is hard to get over. You know what I mean? It destroys your worldview as far as the notions of actual justice in this world.
Well, I've got this funny notion. I think it's a kind of a funny notion because the mainstream media and the government doesn't really share it. But I don't think that children should be molested with impunity. I mean,
All
I,
right,
I
right.
know that, I mean, I know that that's kind of a maybe an out there type thinking, an out there type thought. But yes, I don't believe that children should be molested with impunity. It's one of the things that I'm really dedicated to, and
I mean, I
that's what
wish
drove.
I wish more people were like that because it seems like the scale of this. When I mentioned when we first came on here, like through your experience, do you get a sense of the true scale as far society wide and I guess worldwide too with child trafficking and this type of stuff going on? Like, what's your sense as far as how big the problem really is?
I'll give you some daunting numbers. Okay, we're talking the CDC now, which, and these are very conservative numbers from the CDC, Centers for Disease Control. They say that 25% of American girls have been molested as minors. And they did say that 7% of American boys were molested as minors, but now they say 5%. And most people in the field would say that the number on boys is way conservative and the number of girls is slightly conservative. But if you just go with the CDC numbers, you're talking 50 million Americans have been molested as minors. And that's a staggering number. Now, the number of children that are being trafficked, that number, the different organizations have come up with different numbers. But I would say a conservative number is 300,000 children are trafficked in the United States. And here's the thing about that. People think that it's Mexican children that are being trafficked in the United States and Eastern European children that are being trafficked in the United States. No, it's 85% of the children that are trafficked in the United States are American children. This is a huge problem for our society, is that we've got all these children that are getting molested. And if you can take just one thing out of society, if you took child abuse, child sexual abuse out of society, you would empty the prisons and you would empty the psych wards. I think it would be revolutionary. And what we have to do now is start working on this problem. And I started an organization called Epstein Justice. It's a 501c3. And we've got some really good people working for us. We've got some really good people on our advisory board. And what we are doing is we want a commission. You can go to epsteinjustice.com. We want a commission we want two simple things. We want to know why the government covered up child trafficking in the Epstein case, and we want the perpetrators to be prosecuted. We know who the perpetrators are. We know who the procurers are. The New York Times did an article naming 6 procurers, 5 including Maxwell. And we know who a bunch of the perpetrators are. We have to get this right with our government. We can't let the government cover up child sexual trafficking. We just, as Americans, we can't. And now the right and the left are completely balkanized.
Mm-hmm.
People on the left think people on the right are lunatics. People on the right think people on the left are lunatics. I mean, it's really, Americans have been divided and they've been conquered. This is one issue that can bring the right and the left together that children shouldn't be molested with impunity, and we need a commission. And when I'm talking about a commission, I'm talking about there would be politicians on that commission, but there would also be concerned citizens. It would be something that the politicians couldn't sweep under the rug. And one of the associate directors of Epstein Justice is Alicia Owen, the young woman who was put in solitary for 2 years and given 9 to 15 years for perjury. She is an amazing human being. And I'm so happy that she came aboard Epstein Justice.
Yeah, I encourage everybody to check out Epstein Justice and donate it if you can. What's the next steps with that, Nick? Are you trying to lobby congressmen and senators to take this on so that you can actually form the commission?
Yeah, what we're doing now is there's a couple of congressmen that we're lobbying, and we're going to start. We put on one rally, and we're going to start putting on other rallies. It's been tough because we've been raising money, but it's been slow. And we did learn from the first demonstration protest that we put on that it's expensive to get people to congeal and put on a demonstration. And if people really want to help us out, you can leave your name on Epstein. You can go to our website. You can sign a petition that over 40,000 people have signed. There's a form letter that if you put your name where you're at, it'll go to your congressman. And then you can sign up for our newsletter, which comes out monthly. We are starting to grow now, and it's starting to catch on. Initially, it was really, really tough. We became a 501c3 last July, and it was very, very tough early on. But now we're picking up some momentum. And I think as we pick up momentum, people will be really, I think when Americans wake up to this, because when you have a disease, there's three parts of it. There's awareness, there's acceptance, and there's action. Most Americans are aware that something with Epstein stinks. Where the cognitive dissonance comes in is the acceptance. They're having a hard time accepting that the government would cover up child abuse. Mm-hmm. When we get a critical mass of Americans to that point, then we can really engage in action.
And that's why I think that your book is so important to that particular cause, just because once you, I mean, if you haven't read it and you're listening to this, seriously, and there's also a great Audible version as well that I'd recommend. I listened to that as well. And once you can wrap your head around the scope of this, then that does motivate you to want to give some type of action, whether it's a small space like this where we're discussing it and we can proliferate this recording and just bring awareness. I mean, I think that's how you get anything moving, is just by creating some type of awareness with it. And, Nick, you've done a great job of this, being on the front line. And, you said you had called through the book and spoke to a lot of the victims. Is there any particular, and I'm going to be mindful, I know you only have a few more minutes here, but is there a particular victim or something that especially shocked you, or what you've learned throughout the course of the Epstein ordeal, or an individual who might be in the black book that would shock people?
The sadism of some of our leaders. I mean, I came across it in the Franklin scandal. Some of these guys like to be very sadistic to kids. I mean, that's how they get off. And you had that, excuse me, I've been dealing with some allergies. You've had that in the Epstein case, where some powerful people, that's what they do. That's what they enjoy, is beating up little girls. And one thing, and the media has just been horrific with this, really horrific. And one thing that hasn't been translated at all is child traffickers are vicious people. Epstein and Maxwell were vicious. And they've been sanitized. No one has talked about their viciousness. There was an Epstein victim, Sarah Ransom, that wrote a book, and she really delineated how vicious Epstein et al. was. And that's, I mean, the media should call for justice, but the media hasn't called for justice. The media has just reported on salacious details, and some of them are even wrong. And I find it, the fourth estate is supposed to be a check and balance for our government. And the fourth estate has just bought into the same corruption. And now we have P. Diddy. And the fix is in with P. Diddy, and I can tell you why. Andre Damian Williams Jr. There's a grand jury going on right now with P. Diddy. And Andre Damian Williams Jr. is the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of Manhattan, which is the most powerful law enforcement position in New York City. He is impaneled the grand jury about P. Diddy. Now, it's really interesting. Those search warrants that were executed on P. Diddy came out of they came out of New York, but they were executed in L.A. and Miami, which
and also by the Department of Homeland Security, right?
And that would usually be an FBI thing, but the Department of Homeland Security does have an anti-trafficking part of it. So, I mean, you could say
I just thought that was an odd fact. You know what I mean? Usually, like you said, the FBI. So there's got to be maybe some international aspect. I'm not sure.
Well, I think that the fix is in because Andre Damian Williams was the one who carefully choreographed Ghislaine Maxwell's trial. There were 4 victims of Epstein and Maxwell that were called to testify, and they've been exclusively molested by Epstein and Maxwell. Exclusively. So those 4 witnesses could not talk about the power broker perpetrators. They could not talk about the procurers. They were limited in what they knew. So they could really only talk about Epstein and Maxwell. And Andre Damian Williams Jr. was the one, he was the U.S. attorney that choreographed that trial. And now, and Ghislaine Maxwell, she was indicted on 1 count of child trafficking, which carries a 15-year to life sentence. And that is a travesty because she trafficked kids for over 2 decades. So she should have been indicted on multiple counts of child trafficking.
And in her background, like I said, with her dad, is a whole book in itself as well. If anybody wants to take a look at her dad and his affiliation with Israeli intelligence and the Promise scandal and all that stuff, it's pretty amazing, and it kind of all connects as well. Have you found any thread between Franklin and the Epstein networks at all?
The big thread is William Barr.
Okay.
The attorney general. He was the he was the number 2 guy in the Justice Department under Richard Thornburg. And Richard Thornburg has been named as a perpetrator in the Franklin scandal.
Wow. Okay.
And
Barr went to the Dalton School, or his father ran the Dalton School, right? Which is where Epstein attended.
And his father hired Epstein. Well, here's the thing. William Barr, ultimately, Thornburg went to run for senator in Pennsylvania. That's where he had been governor. And so he stepped down being attorney general. And William Barr put the finishing touches on covering up Franklin. And then he became Trump's attorney general, and he was completely in command of covering up Epstein. And from Epstein killing himself to making sure that the grand juries were essentially run under Democrats, but he made sure that the perpetrators and procurers didn't get indicted. So William Barr is dirty. And over the weekend, I posted a picture of Jeffrey Epstein at Interlochen Arts Camp. And then I posted another picture of who I think is William Barr at Interlochen Camp in 1967. You can go to my website, nickbryant.com, and you can check out whether or not you think that that individual is William Barr. Now, Interlochen has to say that Jeffrey Epstein attended it because he gave $500,000 to Interlochen. They built like the Jeffrey Epstein Lodge. But Interlochen says that William Barr did not attend. But it's kind of interesting that you've got Interlochen and then you've got Epstein and possibly Barr in '67, and then 7 years later, William Barr's father, Donald, hires a college dropout for Dalton, one of the most prestigious schools in the world and preparatory schools in the world. And he hires Jeffrey Epstein. So that picture could be worth 1,000 words or not. You'll have to go to my website and
I actually just posted it in the nest here, if you can see it there. The 1967 picture that you posted. So if anybody wants to check it out, you can just click up above in the nest here.
So let me get into P. Diddy a little bit, and then we can call it a night. Okay, so there's been 8 lawsuits filed against P. Diddy, and 2 of them were women who were minors when he allegedly molested them. And Little Rod filed the 5th lawsuit, and he said that P. Diddy was trafficking children. Actually, he said that P. Diddy was trafficking a lot of children. So, and then he also had the hidden cameras too. What we have is a setup that's very similar to Franklin and to Epstein and now P. Diddy. And now we've got a very corrupt U.S. attorney running a grand jury or overseeing a grand jury that's looking into P. Diddy. So we know that the fix is in, and we just don't know what the fix is. And P. Diddy has a very interesting history. He was a college dropout, and in 1993, he and Clive Davis founded Bad Boy Records, and then he became a superstar. Clive Davis is really a nasty piece of work, really a nasty piece of work. Clive Davis is, there was a documentary about him, which was basically an infomercial, but Clive Davis is notorious in the music business for shenanigans. And in the 70s, he was charged with evading taxes 3 times and 3 counts of, I think, income tax fraud. So there's 6 felonies right there. And then he was busted in the biggest payola scam of all time. And payola is against the law. It's giving radio stations money to play your records. But then the feds busted a Genovese associate named Pasquale Falcone. And Falcone was smuggling 22 pounds of heroin into the United States. And they started to dig into Falcone, and then they saw these shell companies that Falcone and Clive Davis set up. And Clive Davis, he was head of ABC Records at that point. He was funneling money to these shell companies, and him and Falcone were stealing it. And so how does a guy, and Clive Davis has not spent a day in jail, not a single day. So how does a guy commit all those felonies and not spend a single day in jail? I mean, if I'm just kind of surmising or extrapolating, I would say that he's a government informant, or he's helped the government in some ways. And he took P. Diddy by the hand in 1993, and they became hugely successful. If P. Diddy is part of the corruption that I've been talking about, I think it might be a reasonable bet that Clive Davis would be part of that. And Clive Davis will not be indicted by that grand jury. None of the power brokers that went to P. Diddy's freak-offs will be indicted by that grand jury. None of the politicians that went to P. Diddy's freak-offs will be indicted by that grand jury. P. Diddy will be indicted by that grand jury and maybe a couple of his kids and a couple of low-level people, but all those really powerful politicians and celebrities and sports stars that P. Diddy pandered to, none of them will be indicted. That is my prophecy on the P. Diddy grand jury that's being overseen by Andre Damian Williams Jr.
So it won't even reach the level of Epstein where Diddy's going to spend any time and suicide himself. You think it's just basically going to justice will not be met once again? Is your sense of it based upon the attorney general who's handled the case?
I believe, like with Lawrence King and also Ghislaine Maxwell, I believe that, now this is just my surmise, but I think that I've been swimming in this sewer long enough to kind of know. What will happen is they will say, some people in the Department of Justice will say to P. Diddy, probably Andre Damian Williams or one of his minions, P. Diddy, you've done some good work, and we're really grateful. You've had a great run. You've made a lot of money, and you've gotten away with whatever you've wanted to get away with for decades now. And P. Diddy does have a long history of violence, not only violence against women, but violence against other people. And I think ultimately P. Diddy will be given the choice to be or not to be. He can be in a prison, and Maxwell, she chose the prison route. She only got 20 years. I mean, she should be in there for lifetimes for multiple counts of child trafficking. But she kept her mouth shut, and she's already in a dormitory, which is
right.
Which is really, I mean, inmates that have done a lot of time that are getting right, that have shown exemplary behavior over the years and are getting ready to be released, generally get dormitory privileges at that point. She's already in a dormitory. She's been in a dormitory for quite some time at this point. And I think that the same thing will happen with Combs. And
I have the sense that Maxwell, that she's going to get out much earlier than she's supposed to.
That's entirely,
that's just my gut feeling, because the American public's memory is just terrible. And once enough time passes, and that kind of, if this story kind of enters the books of history and it's not pursued any further, or no new revelations come out, I could see her being released on some type of technicality or something, and she'll be no worse for the wear.
Well, she's trying to get released right now on the non-prosecution agreement that the feds made with Epstein, where the feds essentially exonerated all the perpetrators and procurers.
Right.
And then of course it was sealed, but luckily it got unsealed. That's why. Oh, and you can go to my website and read about the Snow murders. That was another huge pedophile network in Detroit. And
what was the name again?
It's called the Snow Killings, and that's the name of the article that I wrote on my blog. And it's about a huge pedophile network. There's actually a diagram of it that's mind-boggling. And those pedophiles were, at a certain point, got to be, I think, extremely vicious, and I think more than one of them. And there is evidence to suggest this, polygraphs and also DNA evidence, mitochondrial DNA, that more than one of them killed these kids. And there was a big part of the network was on Fox Island, and it was exactly like Epstein's Island. It wasn't as opulent, but kids would be flown to Fox Island, and then there would be no escape, and they would be molested, and that's where a lot of child pornography was made.
And speaking of islands, one of our listeners here, Wolf Relius, asked if I could ask you about if you've tracked any connections between Francis Sheldon, his island, and Epstein at all. Is there any connections there?
That's who I'm just talking about, Francis Sheldon.
Oh, okay.
And Francis, and Francis was from a very affluent family, and they gave him all the money he needed to flee the United States. And he was in Amsterdam for a while molesting children, and then he ended up at an orphanage in India. And I've seen pictures of Indian children sitting on his lap,
Oh my
and
God.
it just makes me want to puke. So Epstein, Franklin, Fox Island, P. Diddy, we have to stop this. I mean, this has gone on. When I was pitching the Franklin scandal, people were possibly saying, this can't be going on. And I said, why would it not be going on? Where there's going to be a demand, there's going to be a supply. And I believe that these networks are operating as you and I are speaking. There are kids getting molested as you and I are speaking, and that are part of these huge networks. And we have to. It's going to be a battle. As I said earlier, a very conservative figure is 50 million Americans have been molested as minors. We're not going to be able to. We're not going to be able to save all the children, but we can start by making sure that our government doesn't cover up child sexual trafficking. I mean, that should just be a place where we should start.
It not only cover up, but seemingly participate in some instances as well. Like, I know you wrote the forward to, I believe, Dave McGowan's book, Weird Scenes in the 60s is what that's what it's called. So, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, where it basically breaks down the hippie movement and all the intelligence that was involved within that and all the different killings and suicides that happened in the 60s and the anti-war movement. So that's, I know you got to go, but like the government aspect of this, what do you think about that? Like, he also wrote Program to Kill, which goes into these serial killers, Dave McGowan, that is. I'm sure you're aware of that book. And I'm not sure what to think about all that, but it is very compelling as far as the mind control, hypnosis, that sort of thing that goes into like putting someone in breaking them down and then creating like basically a Manchurian candidate. I mean, have you read into that just speculatively?
Well, and, Dave, I think that his best book was Program to Kill, and a number of serial killers came out of the Phoenix program,
Right.
where
Right.
and in Vietnam, where we basically killed an estimate. Well, the government says 30 to 40,000 innocent Vietnamese. Doug Valentine, who wrote the book, the Phoenix program that came out in 1990, he says it's closer to 200,000. But North Vietnamese.
This is an assassination program, basically, right?
North Vietnamese were infiltrating the South Vietnamese villages and trying to indoctrinate them into communism. And our government felt that we had to start killing people in these villages. And we killed a lot of people, but most of them were innocent South Vietnamese villagers. And Dave traces some of those serial killers back to the Phoenix program. And it makes a lot of sense because once these guys develop an appetite for killing, and then they're supposed to come back to the United States and where they really start to enjoy killing. And then they're supposed to come back to the United States and just be good citizens. I mean, a lot of them, most of them, I think, are going to be severely damaged. My uncle was one of them. He was in Vietnam, and it totally, guilt just ate him alive. And so with these types of things, the Phoenix, who knows what our government is up to now? It's very obvious that our government is not working in our best interest. The congressional approval rating is 13%. That means that almost 90% of Americans don't believe that the government is acting in its best interest, and that's in their best interest, and that's absolutely true. These laws that are getting passed that increase censorship, that increase surveillance, that increase wealth polarization. Americans, we have to, as Americans, our leaders are going to take us off a cliff, but we need to come together. And that's why I think Epstein justice is a very good thing, because I think it's the one way that Americans can come together and we can all agree that children shouldn't be molested with impunity.
You know what, Nick, I think that's a great way to end it here. So
Thanks having me on, Champagne. I enjoyed.
Thanks for joining us and giving us so much of your time, man. I've been following your work, like I said, since I discovered your book, The Franklin Scandal, and it keeps getting better and better. I'm sorry we didn't get to talk about the truth about Watergate, so maybe we can do something in the future about that, because I think that's another one of these things that once you start realizing, holy shit, they've lied about this as well, and there's a whole nother other level to the whole story that it blew my mind. You know what I mean? It just really opened my eyes up to um, history itself, and reassessing what we've been told. And once you put the effort into digging a little deeper, like you've done yourself, a lot of things come into focus. So thank you for all the good work that you do, and hopefully we can talk again sometime.
People have been told about Watergate from the mainstream media is a lie. Everything. And have yourself a great night.
Yep, you too, Nick.
Okay, man.
Take care of
Bye.
yourself. Thanks for everybody listening.